Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into something pretty interesting today. That tricky connection between stress, sleep, and weight loss. You know how those mental barriers can really mess with us?
Yeah, for sure.
You've got a ton of research here to really unpack all that.
It's amazing what we're learning about how connected all of that stuff is.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to think of stress as like a purely mental thing,
Right.
but it hits us physically too. It even affects our weight.
So this isn't just another stress is bad lecture.
Right.
It's more like how we react to stress can mess with our weight loss goals.
It
It's almost like stress has its own personality.
kind of. And you know what's wild? Almost half of Americans say they overeat when they're stressed. Think about that.
Yeah, that's a lot of us grabbing the comfort food.
Totally.
But why does that happen? Is it just willpower or is there something else going on?
It's way more than willpower.
Yeah.
You see, stress isn't always the bad guy. The research actually says in small doses, like those pre-presentation jitters, it can actually make you sharper and more alert.
So a little stress is like a good cup of coffee. It gets you going.
Exactly.
But I guess too much of it, like coffee isn't good either.
You got it. The research calls those small doses acute stress. Lasts for minutes or hours. That's when it's helpful. But when it hangs around for days or weeks, it becomes chronic, and that's when it starts messing with your sleep, your mood, even your hormones.
Okay, so how do we know when it's gone from helpful to harmful? What are the signs?
The research points to some subtle stuff. Trouble sleeping, feeling restless, even physical things like stomach aches and headaches. It's like your body's sending up warning flags.
See, I always thought those were just part of a hectic life, you know? Deadlines, family, trying to juggle everything.
Yeah, modern life is busy. But here's the thing the research highlighted. A lot of that stress is from worrying about the future. Those what-if scenarios that keep us up at night.
Okay, so how do we get off that hamster wheel of worry? I'm a little skeptical, but can you even just stop worrying?
You can. It's not about erasing worry completely, but shifting your focus to right now. The research talks about mindfulness,
Yeah.
not just meditation, but even simple things like paying attention to your senses during normal stuff.
So instead of stressing about tomorrow's presentation while I'm doing dishes, I should focus on the warm water, the smell of the soap, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It sounds basic,
Ugh.
but it's retraining your brain to be where you are, not where your worries are taking you.
I like that. So we talk about how too much stress is bad news, but what about practical tips to actually manage it? I know the research talked about 8 strategies.
Yes.
Let's dive into those.
Absolutely. The first one might seem obvious, but it's often overlooked. Knowing what triggers your stress.
Okay, that makes sense. But isn't that a little bit of a bummer? Like, who wants to dwell on the things that stress them out?
I hear you. It's not always fun.
Hmm.
But think of it like this. The research used this example of someone stressed about their workload. Instead of just pushing through, they figured out the root cause. Unrealistic deadlines. They talked to their boss about that and tackled the stress at the source, not just the symptoms.
So it's about being proactive and finding solutions, not just putting Band-Aids on the problem.
Exactly. And that leads us to strategy number 2. It's all about understanding how you react to stress. We all react differently to pressure, right?
Oh, tell me about it. My best friend loves deadlines. I turn into a puddle of anxiety.
The research actually calls this relearning our reactions to stress. It's like we've learned these automatic responses over time, but we can actually rewire them.
Okay, so how do we do that? Do we need to hypnotize ourselves or something?
It's not that dramatic. The research says start by being self-aware. It talks about journaling, but not just any journaling. It recommends asking yourself certain questions, like what situations triggered you? What did you physically feel? Were your reactions helpful or harmful?
So it's like becoming a detective in your own life, looking for clues and patterns in your reactions.
Precisely. Once you see those patterns, you can swap those unhealthy reactions for healthier ways to cope.
Okay, speaking of healthy coping mechanisms, the next strategy is all about moving more. Does that really make a difference with stress?
It makes a huge difference. The research found that even moderate exercise, we're not talking marathons here, can really lower stress hormones like cortisol.
So even a quick walk around the block or some gardening can help.
Absolutely.
I'm all for that. But what about when you're too stressed to even think about exercising?
That's where the next strategy comes in. Meditation and mindfulness. And it doesn't have to be some intense hour-long session in a silent room. Even just 5 minutes of focused breathing can make a difference.
You know, I've been curious about meditation, but I always thought it was a little too out there for me. Have you ever tried it?
I have, and honestly, it's been a game changer. What I love is that it's not about emptying your mind, but noticing your thoughts and feelings without judgment. It's like training your mind to be more present and less reactive.
That's interesting. Maybe I should give it a shot. I've heard there are some good apps for that.
There are. It's a great way to try different things and find what works for you.
Okay, so we've tackled identifying triggers, understanding our stress response, moving our bodies, and quieting our minds. What's next on our stress-busting list?
This one might surprise you. Improving your sleep habits. It seems so simple, but sleep deprivation really messes with your stress hormones.
You know, I'm actually terrible at getting enough sleep. But what does that have to do with weight loss?
There's this fascinating connection that the research highlights. When you don't sleep enough, your body makes more of the hormone ghrelin, which makes you feel hungry, and less leptin, which tells you when you're full. So you're basically fighting a losing battle with your own body.
Wow, I had no idea it was that powerful. So even if I do everything else right but skimp on sleep, I'm still setting myself up for failure.
It definitely makes it much harder. And it's not just about how many hours you get, but the quality of your sleep, too.
Yeah.
The research talks about sticking to a regular sleep schedule, having a relaxing bedtime routine, and making sure your bedroom is dark, quiet, and cool.
Okay, that's a lot to think about. Maybe we should do a whole deep dive just on sleep. But for now, let's move on to the next strategy, which I think is something we all struggle with. Unlearning emotional eating.
Ah, yes. Food can be such a comfort, especially when we're stressed. But when it becomes our main way of coping, it can create this vicious cycle.
Okay, I'm definitely guilty of that. When I'm stressed, I crave all the carbs and sugar. But how do we break that cycle? It feels so automatic sometimes.
The research suggests a two-pronged approach. First, get really clear on what your triggers are. It's not just stress in general, but the specifics. Is it feeling overwhelmed, lonely, bored? Then once you know those triggers, you can start swapping the food for other coping mechanisms.
So instead of grabbing the cookies when I'm overwhelmed, I could try calling a friend, going for a walk, or finally organizing that messy drawer.
Exactly. It's about finding healthier ways to calm yourself down and deal with those emotions. What works for one person might not work for another, so it's about trying things out and finding what clicks for you.
I like that it's about giving ourselves permission to find what works, not following some strict rule book.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of connecting with others, that brings us to our next strategy. Social support.
Wait, so even just hanging out with friends can help manage stress. Tell me more.
It's more powerful than you think. The research found that spending time with loved ones can lower your cortisol levels and even boost your immune system.
Well, that's good news because I love hanging out with my friends. But is it just about receiving support, or is there something to be said for giving it too?
That's a great point. The research says that both receiving and giving support are incredibly beneficial. It's about creating those two-way relationships where you feel seen, heard, and valued.
So it's like by helping others, we're also helping ourselves.
Exactly. It's this awesome loop of positive energy. And it doesn't have to be anything huge. It could be as simple as listening to a friend helping a neighbor with their groceries, or volunteering for a cause you care about.
That's something I've been meaning to do more of, volunteering. It always feels good to give back.
It does. And it's a win-win for everyone.
Okay, so we've covered 7 strategies so far, and they've all been about managing stress ourselves. But I know the last one is a bit different, right?
You're right. The last strategy is all about seeking professional help. It's important to remember that all of these strategies are for mild stress. If you're dealing with more serious stuff like constant anxiety, panic attacks, or trouble sleeping, it's crucial to talk to a mental health professional.
Sometimes it feels like there's a stigma around asking for help, but it really is a sign of strength, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It takes courage to admit you need support. And there are so many resources available: therapists, counselors, support groups. There's no shame in reaching out and getting the help you deserve.
That's so important to remember. And it's not just mental stuff either, right? The research mentions some physical signs that stress has gone too far, like unexplained pains, forgetfulness, even withdrawing from social situations.
You're right, those are all red flags that you need professional help. It's about putting your well-being first and speaking up for yourself.
Okay, so that was a lot of information, but it's also valuable. I'm already feeling more prepared to tackle my own stress levels.
That's great to hear. And remember, this is just the start of the conversation. We've laid the groundwork, but now it's about you exploring these ideas and finding what works best for you.
I love that. This deep dive has given me so much to think about, and I can't wait to put some of these strategies into action.
Awesome. You know, going through these 8 strategies, it really struck me how differently we all experience stress.
Oh, it's so true. I have friends who can handle tons of pressure, and I freak out over a lost to-do list. What makes us so different?
The research says it's a mix of nature and nurture. Our genes play a role, but so does how we grew up and past experiences. It's like we all have this internal stress thermostat set differently.
So some of us are just wired to be more sensitive. That feels a little unfair.
It can seem that way, but the good news is even if you're prone to stress, you're not stuck that way forever. The research really pushes that we can learn to manage our stress response better no matter where we start.
Okay, that's good to hear. So even if my stress thermostat is on high alert, I can still turn it down a bit.
Exactly, like building muscle. The more you practice those coping skills, the stronger you get.
I like that analogy. It feels less like I'm fighting my nature and more like training myself to be calmer, more in control.
That's the spirit.
Mm.
Speaking of control, I think it's time we get back to weight loss. We talked about how stress messes with our hormones and makes it harder to lose weight. But what about those mental and emotional roadblocks that sabotage us?
Oh, those are the worst. It's like my own brain is my biggest enemy. I started diet all motivated, then one bad day and I'm back to the ice cream.
You've hit on something really important. The research says weight loss isn't just about calories in and calories out. Our thoughts, emotions, and beliefs play a huge role in our success.
So it's not just about willpower. There's more to it than being good.
Way more. Think about it. If you're constantly beating yourself up, feeling deprived, punishing yourself for slip-ups, it's going to be so hard to stay motivated and make real changes.
Ugh, it's like I'm setting myself up to fail before I even start.
Exactly. That's why the research talks about self-compassion, not about letting yourself off the hook, but treating yourself with the same kindness you'd give a struggling friend.
Self-compassion. That sounds a little too touchy-feely for me. How does that actually help with weight loss?
It changes everything. When you're kind to yourself, you're less likely to get derailed by setbacks. You can admit to slip-ups without feeling like a failure, then get back on track without the guilt.
So instead of beating myself up for eating that ice cream, I should just acknowledge it and move on. That seems almost too easy.
It's not always easy, but it's way better than the self-punishment cycle. The research actually suggests this thing called loving-kindness meditation to help with this self-compassion. It's about sending good vibes to yourself and others.
Loving-kindness meditation. I've never heard of that. But I'm willing to try anything at this point. Any other tips for getting over those mental hurdles?
One that stuck with me was focusing on progress, not perfection. The research found people who set realistic goals and celebrate small wins are more likely to stick with it in the long run.
That makes sense. I always get hung up on reaching a certain number on the scale. I forget to celebrate the small stuff. Like, hey, I went for a walk instead of watching TV. That's a win.
Exactly. It's about changing your perspective. Focus on the good changes you're making, no matter how small.
I'm definitely going to try that. It feels way more motivating than my usual all-or-nothing way.
And remember, you don't have to do this alone. There are tons of resources out there. Support groups, online communities, therapists who specialize in weight loss. Don't be afraid to reach out and find a community that gets you and can cheer you on.
That's a great point. It's easy to feel like you're the only one struggling, but there's strength in numbers.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, I think it's time we move on and talk about the role of community in our overall well-being. It's not just about weight loss, but having a support system that helps us thrive in all parts of our lives.
You know, I've been thinking a lot about that lately. With all the technology we have, it feels like we're more connected than ever, but also more isolated. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. There's research on this. It's called the paradox of connection. We're constantly seeing other people's perfect lives online, which makes us feel more alone and not good enough.
Wow, the paradox of connection. I love that. It really captures that feeling of being around people online but still feeling lonely.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to really connect with people in real life. It's about quality over quantity, spending time with people who really care and make us feel seen.
So it's about putting down the phone and actually talking to people in person.
That's a great start. The research also says try joining groups or clubs that match your interests, volunteering, or even just chatting with people in your neighborhood.
I love that idea. It's about getting out of our comfort zones and remembering we're all in this together.
And it's not just about finding a community. It's about being part of it. When we give back to others, we strengthen those connections and feel better about ourselves too.
So another win-win.
Exactly. Whether it's volunteering, helping a friend, or being a kind neighbor, those small things can make a big difference in our lives and the lives of those around us.
It makes you realize community isn't just a place. It's a feeling. It's belonging and knowing you're not alone.
That's a great way to put it. And it's important to remember that community can exist online too. There are so many great online groups where people connect over shared interests, passions, even struggles.
Oh, I totally agree. I've found so much support and inspiration in online groups for things I love. It's amazing how technology can bring people together even when they're far apart.
It really is. And as we keep navigating this crazy modern life, it's more important than ever to have that sense of community both online and offline. It's in those connections that we find support, meaning, and a sense of belonging.
And those connections are key for our overall well-being. They help us manage stress, build resilience, and thrive in all parts of our lives. I think that's a perfect way to move on to the final part of our deep dive. Talking about all of this stress, sleep, weight loss, and even community,
Right.
it makes me think about the bigger picture.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's easy to get caught up in the individual pieces, but it's so fascinating how it all comes together,
Yes.
for our well-being.
Yeah, it's like we've been focusing on different puzzle pieces, and now we're stepping back to see the whole thing.
Exactly. And what the research really highlights is it's not about being perfect in any one area, but finding that balance that works for you and keeps you healthy and happy.
So not about being a perfect sleeper or marathon runner or having a perfect social life. It's more like realizing all these things are connected and taking care of ourselves in one area helps everything else.
Precisely. The research uses this analogy of a garden. If you ignore one part of it, it affects the whole thing, right? Like if we're only sleep deprived, it not only messes with our energy and mood, but also increases stress, weakens our immune system, and makes healthy eating harder.
Oh, that garden analogy really makes sense. I've definitely been there. When one thing goes wrong, it leads to another, and I just feel overwhelmed and out of control.
It happens. But the good news is we can change those patterns. By taking a more holistic view and seeing how everything's connected, we can create a better path forward.
I'm starting to see that. It's not about being perfect, but making small, steady choices that are good for our minds, bodies, and everything.
That's it. And what's really empowering is that our needs and priorities change over time. What worked in our 20s might not work in our 40s or 50s.
Too true. It's like we're always learning, growing, and adapting to new phases in life. It's not about finding the one right way, but being open to trying different things and seeing what works for us at each stage.
I love that. That curiosity and willingness to try new things is so important for creating a life that feels real and true to you.
I love that. It's not about some strict rule book, but listening to ourselves and figuring out what makes us truly happy, healthy, and whole.
And sometimes that means asking for help from others, whether it's a therapist, a coach, a mentor, or a good friend. Having people to support us, encourage us, give us perspective, and keep us accountable can really make a difference.
As we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm feeling a sense of hope and empowerment. It's easy to get bogged down in the negativity, but when we step back, we realize we have more control over our well-being than we think.
I'm so happy to hear that. I completely agree. We can make choices every day that support our physical, mental, and emotional health, whether it's prioritizing sleep, exercising, eating healthy food, or connecting with loved ones. Those small acts of self-care really make a difference.
It's like we've been given this awesome toolkit with all these strategies and techniques, and we get to choose what works for us and use them to create a life that feels amazing and fulfilling.
Exactly. And remember, self-care isn't selfish. It's actually essential. When we take care of ourselves, we can better care for others and make a positive impact on the world.
That's a great point. So to wrap up today's episode, I want to leave you with this thought. You are worthy of care. You're worthy of love, and you have the power to create a life filled with joy, purpose, and well-being.
I love that. It all starts with taking that first step and then another.
And another.
One day at a time, one choice at a time.
This deep dive has been such a journey, and I hope you feel inspired to keep exploring these ideas and finding what works best for you. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.